So, what if the stories of the great Quranic prophets weren't just, written in holy books, but were actually etched into the very stones of ancient Egypt? Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating theory that tries to connect these sacred figures to actual, real historical records.
Okay, so the big question we're asking today is a pretty bold one. Can we actually find traces of Idris, Yusuf, and Musa, and you might know them as Enoch, Joseph, and Moses, right there in the hieroglyphs and the royal histories of ancient Egypt? It sounds wild, I know, but let's take a look at what the evidence suggests.
All right, let's start at the very beginning, literally the dawn of Egyptian civilization, in what's called the Old Kingdom. We're on the hunt for our first figure, the prophet Idris. The theory we're exploring basically sees him as one of the founding fathers of Egyptian wisdom itself.
So, the Quran tells us that Idris was a man of truth, who was raised to a high station. And that phrase, high station, is really the key here. It's the clue that this theory uses to try and unlock who he might have been in the historical record.
And this is where things get super interesting. The theory starts connecting the dots, linking the Islamic prophet Idris to the Hebrew Enoch and even the Greek god Hermes. But for us, the most important connection, the one we're really digging into, is to two Egyptian figures, the wisdom god Thoth and a real historical man named Imhotep.
So who was this Imhotep guy? Well, for starters, he wasn't a myth. He was a real flesh-and-blood genius. We have historical records from Egypt's third dynasty that show he was the architect of the very first pyramid. Not only that, he was also a high priest and a top advisor to King Djoser. I mean, this guy was a monumental figure.
Now, this is absolutely central to the whole theory. Over the centuries, the memory of this brilliant human, Imhotep, just grew and grew. First, he was looked up to as a patron of scribes. But then, get this, thousands of years after he died, he was actually deified, worshipped as a god. The argument is that this is the historical echo of Idris, a real prophet, a man so wise that later generations literally started to worship.
Okay, let's fast forward about 1,000 years. We're jumping into Egypt's Middle Kingdom now. And here, we're going to investigate our second figure, the prophet Yusuf, who you probably know as Joseph.
So, right off the bat, the theory points out a really interesting historical detail. In the story of Yusuf, the Quran consistently calls the ruler king, but the book of Exodus uses the word Pharaoh. Now, here's the thing. Historians confirm that the title Pharaoh wasn't actually used until much later in the New Kingdom. So for people who support this theory, this little detail is a huge clue that the Quran's account is locked into the correct time period.
Okay, but where's the physical proof, right? Well, the theory points to a very powerful official called a king vizier. Think of him as a prime minister who is serving at exactly this time. It also points to something called the famine stele, which is a rock inscription talking about a devastating 7-year famine. And maybe the most incredible part? Archaeologists have found a bunch of ancient seals from this era with the name Yaqub-Hur on them. A pretty stunning potential link to Yusuf's father, Jacob.
And that role, a king vizier managing a massive national crisis, it just aligns perfectly with how the Quran describes Yusuf's job. It says he was put in charge over the storehouses of the land. I mean, that's exactly the kind of authority you would need to save an entire kingdom from starving.
All right, for our final case file, we're heading into the New Kingdom. This was the absolute peak of Egyptian power, a time that was both glorious and, well, pretty terrifying. We're searching for Musa, or Moses, and I'll tell you right now, this is probably the most complex and evidence-packed part of our whole investigation.
So this interpretation lays out a very specific timeline of pharaohs. It suggests that Musa was found as a baby by the famous queen Hatshepsut. Then, the next ruler, Thutmose III, is identified as the pharaoh of the oppression, and his son, Amenhotep II, is tagged as the pharaoh of the Exodus. And it goes even further, proposing a specific Egyptian identity for Musa himself, a man named Senenmut, who was Queen Hatshepsut's powerful and most trusted advisor.
But what about the plagues? We all know the story. Well, this view offers a scientific explanation. It argues they weren't just random, separate events, but a single cascading ecological disaster. The potential trigger? The massive volcanic eruption on the island of Thera. You can see the logic. The eruption causes a flood, the flood creates wetlands, the wetlands attract locusts and breed frogs and other pests. Then, when the frogs die off, they rot, and their bacteria pollutes the Nile, turning it toxic and red. It's like a chain reaction, a terrible domino effect.
You know, a lot of critics point to the figure of Haman, who's mentioned with Pharaoh in the Quran, and say, see, that's a historical error? But this interpretation has an answer for that. It identifies him with a very real, very powerful Egyptian title, Hamane Tapa Je Nin Gem, which means the high priest of the god Amun. And that wasn't just some small-time job. This guy was basically the second most powerful man in the entire empire.
And get this. This interpretation sees Musa's miracles as a kind of symbolic warfare. Each miracle is a direct challenge to the most sacred symbols of the pharaoh's power. So the staff becoming a serpent? That's taking on the uraeus, the royal cobra on the pharaoh's crown. The shining hand? That's a direct counter to the Eye of Ra, the symbol of the sun god's power. This wasn't just magic tricks. This was theology as warfare.
And the theory brings in a whole series of other records to back this up. We're talking a tomb painting that actually shows Semitic slaves making bricks with straw. Then there's the Ipuwer papyrus, which is this ancient text that describes total chaos, plagues, and a river of blood. Then an inscription from El Arish mentions a great whirlpool and a king disappearing at sea. And to top it all off, an Egyptian record from around 1400 BCE that refers to the Shasu of Yahweh, which basically means the nomads of God out in the desert.
But here's one of the most precise points, and it's pretty incredible. Egyptian belief was that when a pharaoh died, the entire cosmos, heaven and earth, would literally weep for him. The Quran, written thousands of years later, offers this direct, sharp rebuttal to that very specific belief. And neither heaven nor earth wept for them. It's such a pointed counter-narrative.
Okay, so we've looked at all these individual clues and pieces of evidence spread out over 2,000 years of history. Let's take a step back now and look at the big picture that this whole theory is painting for us.
So here it is, the entire theory laid out on a timeline. What it suggests is this continuous prophetic presence right inside Egypt's own history. You've got Idris as the architect Imhotep back in the Old Kingdom, then you have Yusuf as that famine-saving vizier in the Middle Kingdom, and finally, Musa, identified as the official Senetmut, going head-to-head with the pharaohs of the New Kingdom.
So when you put it all together, the main argument of the theory we've been exploring is pretty clear. It's proposing that maybe the Quran can be read not just as scripture, but also as a kind of historical lens. A lens that might actually help us clarify timelines, correct old titles, and even add some missing characters to the epic story of ancient Egypt.
And all of this leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought. I mean, if an interpretation like this is even possible, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other historical truths might be hiding in plain sight, right there in ancient texts, just waiting for someone to come along with a new way of looking at them?